Now, I would like to turn this over to Michael Barkley, who has collected some positive climate stories for us. And he's going to share as many as I let him. So
Do
you're
my best.
on.
Thanks. So I really want to thank everybody for sending in information. I put out an email and I asked people for some hopeful stories. And sometimes when we ask people, things, we don't get a lot of response. Well, this time, I don't know, there must have been about 17 people who wrote in about their stories. There were tons of them that came in, and I had 40 or 50 of them before I started this project. And I didn't use one of them. I just used all of yours. And I can't even get through all of the ones that you sent in. So I really want to thank all of you for providing that input. It was really heartening. It actually made me hopeful. So it's interesting. So let's take a look at some of those. I wanted to start with this quote that's on the screen because I think it's just a sort of excellent way to begin this conversation. Is from Christy, and she sent me it was part of the response to the hopeful stories, and she said, "What's on the screen? I've been reflecting a lot lately about the sort of dark path that the world's taking today, and thinking that even kindness or small acts of environmental kindness may be what will allow us to continue despite a new reality that is not of our choosing." And I think this is a great way to begin this conversation. So thanks, Christy, for sending that along. Let's look at some energy systems too. I've tried to break up the stories into various aspects of the kinds of things we see in the news. So closer to home, this is Quebec and Ontario have agreed to swap energy up to 600 megawatts of electricity a year, which is a fair amount. They're not going to pay each other for it. They're just going to swap it. So we need energy in the summer in Ontario, and they need more in the winter for peak use. And it also may allow us to use a lot less gas plant energy. And this is something that in the previous Liberal government and the current Conservative government, there was a refusal to accept electricity from Quebec. So this is a huge change that's happening. In terms of clean energy, this is a picture of our turbine in Toronto. This was built at Exhibition Place. The whole project started in the 1990s and started producing electricity in 2003, enough power for 108 homes. And 20 years later, that is still going strong. That's just a local example. Globally, solar photovoltaic energy systems alone accounted for 3/4 of renewable capacity additions worldwide. So global renewable energy capacity, it's at a pace that is really significant, and it grew at its fastest pace in the last 20 years, in the last few years. So it's really an amazing change that's happened. And it can put the world within reach of meeting a key climate target that was decided at COP28 by the end of the decade, by the end by 2030, according to the International Energy Agency. That's the one of tripling renewable energy capacity. And this chart sort of shows the sort of uptick in that. That's a very positive story about what's happening with renewable energy. In Portugal, they ran the whole country on 100% renewable energy for 6 days in a row. No other energy source, just renewables. So for nearly a week, the country of 10 million met the customer needs with wind, hydro, solar, and this picture, which is, a turbine that's off the coast of Portugal. And it was sort of a test run for operating their grid without fossil fuels. And the interesting thing about this is that for 90%, 95% of that time, Portugal exported clean energy to Spain because it consistently had more than it needed. Again, no burning of gas, oil, or coal. This is just a quick chart about the cost of energy in Ontario. I want you to look at the far left. I haven't got a pointer here, but the 1.6 cents on the far left is energy efficiency. That's what it costs. if you're wanting to spend money on how to reduce the use of fossil fuels, this is the most energy efficient or the most cost effective thing you can do is to reduce energy efficiency, improve energy efficiency, sorry. And on the far right is the cost of a new nuclear plant. So you've got 1.6 cents per kilowatt hour and 24.4 cents per kilowatt hour to build a new nuclear plant. So which one would you do? And in between are sort of a lot of the renewable energy. And right next to the far right column is 22.7 cents. That's new gas-fired peaker plants that the Ontario government's currently building. So you can see that that the cost of solar, wind, energy efficiency, Quebec water is 5.3 cents. All of this is significantly cheaper than trying to do new nuclear. And this kind of information is really important for decision makers. Solar installations, they sort of change our climate future, just so, like we saw on that chart, the solar thing is just going crazy. So humanity will install 413 gigawatts of solar this year. That's actually an astonishing amount of power. 58% more in 2023 than in 2022, which itself in 2022 had a 42% increase from 2021. That means the world's solar capacity has doubled in the last 18 months. And that solar is now the fastest growing technology in history, which is interesting little stat. So these installations are now way ahead of their trajectory required to reach net zero by 2050. And if it maintains that kind of growth, it will become the world's dominant source of energy before the end of this decade, not 2050, but 2030. There's a green manufacturing boom, mainly in the United States due to the Inflation Reduction Act. It resulted in the largest manufacturing drive in the United States since World War II. The $300 billion in new battery, solar, hydrogen, electrolyzer plants all over the states. There's a record 33 gigawatts of solar installed across the country. Carbon emissions are actually set to fall by around 3% this year. And Texas, you know, the oil place, is undergoing the fastest pace of clean energy expansion anywhere in the world outside of China. Just think about that, the oil capital of the United States. California's battery storage capacity has surged tenfold in just 3 years, and 12 states have passed laws requiring a shift to 100% clean electricity. So we often see this big macro thing about, you know, how bad things are, but then when you start looking more locally at a state or provincial level, or at a municipal level, things are changing a little more rapidly. Finance progress, there's money flowing out of coal, oil, and gas and flowing into renewables. This story isn't so good with Canadian banks, but banks around the world are starting to shift their financing, and this is a very important aspect of the future. These are Greenpeace protesters being led out of Chrystia Freeland's office around this particular issue. So over 75% of coal-fired electricity in the OECD is now on track to close by 2030. And a lot of this has to do with the banks withdrawing their financing. Danske, the second largest bank in the Nordic region, declared an end to fossil fuel financing completely. SMBC Group in Japan said it will phase out all exposure to coal mining by 2040. And Australia's largest bank ruled out finance for new oil and gas expansion. And there's lots more examples. Solar and teachers. This I thought was a really interesting story. Back in 2021, a school district in the small town of Batesville, Arkansas, made headlines when it announced that it would raise its teacher salaries by up to $15,000 a year. Teachers don't make much in the States, so this is a big deal. 15,000 is a lot of money as a raise. Thanks to all the money they save from putting in solar arrays on every single school. Think about that for me. I think this is really an amazing story. And within a year, their school superintendent heard of 30 other school districts that are doing exactly the same thing in Arkansas. And that is extended to other states where they're doing the same thing. And some of them are providing funds, the funds from the savings to, like one school district is funding a food and shoes program for all the kids who come from the Indian Reserve that's part of their town, because the kids are coming to school hungry and without proper clothing. Transportation, there's another sort of topic area. Toronto, we've got bike lanes that are going to stretch across the entire city on Bloor Street. That's a change that was, some people didn't want, but now we're going to get it. And the budget includes a commitment to share the cost of 70 new subway trains to replace the aging Line 2 fleet. The other levels of government are pending, but there's a lot of pressure on them to support this initiative coming from the city. And TTC is back up to 70% of its ridership pre-COVID and 75 to 80% on the weekends. So people are starting to come back to using transit. So we're making progress there. France is an interesting story. The French government recently suspended an electric car leasing scheme after only 6 weeks. And this sounds like a bad news story, but it's not, because it followed a surge in demand for the program that more than doubled the number of vehicles that were required in order to be able to meet their target. So the official said that the scheme was launched in December, and the idea is to help low-income households cut their carbon emissions, and that 25,000 European-built vehicles would be offered to lease from 100 euros a month. And the demand for this program was incredible. They received 90,000 applications, and they only had 25,000 cars available. Like, they couldn't build the cars fast enough, so they had to put this scheme on hold because of that, not because they changed their mind. Car battery recycling, everybody is, you always hear stories, and these are the kind of disinformation stories you get about, oh, well, the EV batteries are, you can't recycle them. Well, we actually have 2 plants that recycle them in Canada, but this is another story about researchers having developed a recycling method that allows recovery of 100% of the aluminum in this and 98% of the lithium in electric batteries. And these Swedish researchers have developed a new, more effective way of recycling batteries that will recover 98% of all the materials within a battery. So and they can be reused. So the recovery of these valuable metals found in EV batteries is the process is improving, and it doesn't require the use of any expensive or harmful chemical in the process. So that's interesting too. Battery technology, making some leaps forward. The world's largest battery maker, CATL, announced a new battery that will double the density of Tesla's batteries, which will go into production imminently. Toyota, the world's largest car maker, claimed it had developed a solid-state battery with 1,000 kilometers of range, which also uses a lot less lithium and other chemicals than the other batteries. But that got trumped, excuse the word, by Chinese EV maker NIO, this car on the screen, which pulled off the 1,000-kilometer battery that's selling currently in the Chinese market. So they've already done it. The Swedish manufacturer Northvolt announced a breakthrough in sodium batteries, an element that that's cheaper, more abundant, and more sustainable than lithium. So lots of progress on the battery front, which is very interesting. This is I think, an important story because you also get, well, if we have electric batteries, we've got the problem of mining this stuff and where does it come from? And so in 2023, there were discoveries of huge deposits of lithium in the United States and phosphate in Norway. There was a plunge in lithium and cobalt prices as new mines and processing plants solved lots of shortages sooner than was expected. And multiple studies are showing that the world has enough materials for a complete clean energy transition of every single vehicle being run on electricity. Reaching net zero will only take 1/4, and this is without the sodium batteries coming on board. Reaching net zero will only take 1/4 of today's lithium reserves, 1/3 of the nickel, and 1/4 of known cobalt resources. Keeping in mind that the technology is changing and a lot of these things won't be required, apparently. So the argument, of course, is that mining is destructive, it's exploitative, and there are lots of human rights abuses that can occur in this process, and all of that's true. But the interesting thing is that it has to kind of be put in perspective of what the fossil fuel economy requires. First of all, it requires 535 times more mining than a clean energy economy of those materials we just talked about. So transitioning to the clean energy would reduce the volume and harm of mining dramatically. So we think, yes, we've got a problem with mining the lithium and the cobalt and so on, but the actual existing problem with mining oil and gas is even worse than what it will be if we made this transition. And hopefully the sodium batteries and so on will be even better. So that you have to, it's very interesting how you have to kind of put these things in perspective. So I thought this was a really interesting story about aviation fuel. There's an aviation company that's developed a new type of jet fuel made entirely from human sewage. Chemists at a lab in Gloucester have turned human waste into kerosene. So the Firefly Green Fuel CEO, James Highgate, said, "We wanted to find a really low value feedstock that was highly abundant." And of course, poo is abundant. Independent tests by international aviation regulators have found that it's nearly identical to standard fossil fuel. Now, there's an interesting story about EV charging in Canada, and that the number of charging ports has tripled since 2018, which is really lowering a major barrier to widespread EV adoption. So one of the things we always hear is that, well, there's not enough charging places and people are concerned about range anxiety with EVs. And that's all of that, I think, is true. But things are changing fairly rapidly in Canada. So I think this is really a good news story. The market's going to get a boost as well by the federal government's zero emission vehicle mandate called the Electric Vehicle Availability Standard, which they announced recently. It's a slew of government policies that have been rolled out in 2022-23. So as of October 2023, the total number of operational fast chargers and super fast chargers across the country has grown to 26,500, up from 7,605 in 2018. That means in just 6 years, Canada added almost 19,000 new charge ports, or 3.5 times more than 2018. The largest number in Quebec, followed by Ontario and then BC. There are lots of other examples. I'll quickly go through the list that's on this slide. And they're all about ways in which we are changing our relationship to oil and gas, how we are seeing a transition. And it's hard to see sometimes in our own country, but if we look around the world, we'll see lots of examples. So the European Union pumped out 8% less carbon dioxide from fossil fuels it burned in 2023 than it did in 2022. So that means these emissions are down to their lowest level in 60 years. The European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change listed 13 recommendations and included urgently phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Europe is way ahead of North America. Germany's emissions hit a 70-year low as it reduces its reliance on coal. A lot of this, of course, had to do with its dependence on Russia disappearing for natural gas. The country emitted 73 million fewer tons of greenhouse gases in 2023 than it did the year before. So the share of electricity generated in Spain from renewable sources rose to 50.8% in 2023. And that was from 42.2% a year earlier as the country moves towards its decarbonization goals. So there's exponential growth going on in Spain. They're seeking to raise their renewables to 4/5 by 2030, according to a government plan issued in June of 2023. Uruguay.
Michael, oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I thought you'd forgotten Uruguay. So I'll just shut up for a sec and then I'll cut Uruguay before the Spain one. No problem.
Uruguay's green power revolution is a rapid shift to wind power. And it's kind of showing how the world it can be done. Today, the country has almost phased out fossil fuels in electricity production. Depending on the weather, anything between 90 and 95% of its power comes from renewables. In some years, that number has crept as high as 98%. So they're in a similar place, obviously, to where Portugal is. And in Canada, December alone saw a series of consequential announcements that lay the groundwork for deep emission reductions. The draft regulations to reduce methane emissions. The methane regulations were a really important stepping stone to what came immediately after, which is the regulatory framework for oil and gas sector emissions cap. Oil and gas production is the single biggest source of heat trapping pollution in Canada. And the sector's backsliding is wiping out climate progress and a lot of other parts of the economy. So this is a really important piece of legislation. And to round out December's federal policy hat trick, the zero emissions vehicle regulations were released. More than a dozen countries have policies to what Canada introduced, requiring vehicle sales to be 100% electric by 2035 or sooner. In addition to these December announcements, several other major policy pieces that move forward in 2023. Clean fuel regulations, updated carbon pricing, and a draft clean energy regulations. The National Adaptation Strategy was also finalized in June of 2023, an essential building block to protect Canadians from the effects of climate change. So you can see that there's a lot happening in Canada in the background, doesn't get the headlines, but in fact, the government has seriously been working at trying to bring in solutions for the future. Legal battles. Let's take a look at some of the things that are happening around the world on this front. 7 young people took the next step in their landmark challenge of Ontario's climate change plan, arguing before the province's highest court that the government's weakened emissions target was a violation of their rights. You might remember that story. A federal court of appeal ruling last month reopened the door for 15 young people to bring a constitutional challenge against the Canadian government over its response to climate change. The cases are 2 prominent Canadian examples of youth-led climate cases going before judges. And there's lots of them around the world. In August, a Montana judge said state agencies had violated the constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment of young people who brought the lawsuit. In September, 6 young people in Portugal brought a case accusing 32 European governments of violating their human rights for what they argue is a failure to adequately address climate change. The UK advertising watchdog banned 2 Toyota advertisements for condoning driving that disregards its environmental impact in a landmark ruling, stating that the SUV ads had been created without, quote, a sense of responsibility to society. Now, Canada's big 5 banks are potentially misleading investors with their use of terms like sustainable finance, according to a complaint to securities regulators by a climate advocacy group. In Switzerland, the Klimasenioren are taking the government to the European Court of Human Rights for doing too little to tackle the climate crisis. There's also youth-led cases in Germany, France, and Ireland. And in the notes to this, there'll be a link to a TED Talk about this. It's very interesting how youth are leading a lot of these litigations. It's great to see. How about nature? There's another good news story area. I think humanity has sort of retreated, I think, behind closed doors to wait out the ravages of COVID-19, and kind of the rest of the natural world emerged from the shadows. So there's lots of really interesting stories about what happened in a very short period of time when wildlife sort of moved back into the shadows when humans were kind of sheltering in place. There's a film called The Coronavirus Lockdown Effect on Animals, and it apparently has over 6 million views for scenes like the ones that are listed here: wild boar roaming Italian towns, Japanese sika deer walking in the streets of Nara, a family of Egyptian geese crossing the empty tarmac of Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. The water is visibly cleaner in Venice. Wild goats are browsing in Wales, and flocks of wild turkeys strutting around about Harvard Yard. And the endangered leatherback sea turtle, for example, is making a comeback on Thailand's deserted beaches during this time. So it's very interesting to see how nature can, in fact, rebound if we give it a chance. I think that's probably the lesson for that. Conservation efforts. The Danube Delta Biosphere Reserve is fast becoming a landscape of abundant wildlife. But until recently, much of it was highly degraded, dried out by excessive land draining. And today, thanks to a project run by Rewilding Europe, this landscape is being allowed to reflood naturally, and the shallow waters and reed beds are becoming spawning grounds for fish and nesting sites for many endangered birds and fish species. The marine conservation charity Blue Ventures worked along the coast of Madagascar with fishing communities who are dependent on dwindling octopus and crabs by closing certain areas to allow them to recover. Communities are able to fish sustainably and support themselves. It's important because more than 1 billion people throughout the world rely on fish as a source of protein. And small-scale fisheries support the livelihoods of at least 500 million people worldwide. In the Amazon, indigenous peoples have managed to save a vast area from exploitation and destruction, thanks to legal recognition for at least the Kayapo and Jingu people, at least. As a result, 10 legally ratified indigenous territories, which totals 35 million acres, 14 million hectares, remains as a green forest in a surrounding sea of brown and home to roughly 12,500 Indians.
So you're freezing. So can we just go back to, you were talking about the indigenous,
in the Amazon,
the legal recognition. Yeah.
I'll start from in the Amazon.
I don't know if it's my internet or your internet. Sorry about that.
That's okay. In the Amazon, indigenous peoples have managed to save a vast area from exploitation and destruction, thanks to the legal recognition of the Kayapo and Chingo people. As a result, 10 legally ratified indigenous territories, totaling 35 million acres or 14 million hectares, remained as green forest in a surrounding sea of brown, and home to roughly 12,500 Indians from 14 different groups. We always hear a lot about the Amazon and the destruction of it, but there are some good news stories as well. Over the past decade, the Dominican Republic has regreened 1/5 of the country, thanks to the Yaco River Basin Restoration Project, a project which uses a simple strategy of convincing landowners that reforesting their farms is beneficial for them, has reduced soil degradation by 18%. And for the first time in a decade, the Environmental Protection Agency in the States has tightened regulations on air pollution, lowering the allowable limits for annual PM 2.5 levels from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to 9. So the reduction is going to, they predict anyhow, to reap a $46 billion in net health benefits by 2032. That's a significant amount of money, but the more important part is including prevention of up to 800,000 asthma attacks and 4,500 premature deaths. Bhutan has experienced its protected area network with a new biological corridor connecting Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary and Boomdeling Wildlife Sanctuary in the country's east. So the region is home to hundreds of unique flora and fauna species, including the snow leopard, red panda, and Ludlow's Bhutan glory. So these are really important steps in Bhutan. As the site of what's been called the greenest river recovery in Europe, the Mersey River is continuing to thrive with sightings of dolphins, harbor porpoises, jellyfish, and 5 species of sharks. Last year, 45 different kinds of fish were found in the river, triple the amount recorded in 2002. Not too bad for a river that was declared biologically dead 40 years ago. Chile has formally created the new Valle Cochamo Nature Sanctuary. It's one of the country's largest protected areas, spanning 14 square kilometers of forest, glaciers, and million-year-old rocks. The region is home to 12 forest types, 50 animal species, and one of the most important water reserves in the world. These folks are from Vancouver Island University, and they are headed to Clayoquot territory, members of the Vancouver Island University IPCA Planning Certificate Program. They're the cohort from 2022. So it's a first of its kind of program on Vancouver Island, the university, which trains students to steward Indigenous protected and conserved areas. The curriculum of the year-long program at the university was developed by Isaac Olam, an Indigenous-led not-for-profit that is dedicated to building capacity for Indigenous protected and conservation areas, or IPCAs. Monica Shore, who is the co-founder and executive director of this program and an instructor for the certificate program, says it was created to address the need for more planners to adequately and appropriately support Indigenous-led conservation, which are required for Canada to meet its ambition conservation targets. So I think this is a good place to end. It gives us kind of a happy picture here of young people who are deciding to take a university course that is going to benefit the land and the people in BC, and I'm sure much further than that. So thanks for listening. I think this is just the beginning, I hope, of a whole number of good news stories that we can continue to share, because I think it's very important for us to see that the news headlines are not everything that's happening in the world. So thanks.
It's just amazing. And all of those stories were shared by some of them by people in this room and by others as well. But just a couple of things. We have to try to figure out how to get these stories more widely distributed. And why don't we make this a regular feature of our meetings? So that's just a smattering of the positive comments that came through the chat while you were sharing all that good, positive news with us. So that is fantastic.
The other thing that we would really like you to consider is sharing this information, sharing the video, sharing the slides and the commentary that we'll be able to give to you with other people so that everyone has a chance to realize that things are changing, things are getting better. I think in a presentation recently that Caroline and I did, we showed a slide where we looked at oil, gas, and coal, and for the last 5 years, the use of those materials has flattened. And that is exactly what the world says we have to do. We have to stop the increase of the use of fossil fuels and see that curve go down. And I think these stories give us a sense that it's not always the big picture things that are all going to make the difference. Yes, they're important, but it's the small things that are happening all around us that we really don't get a chance to hear about or see. So sharing this material, I think, would just be a wonderful thing if you can do that. And it'll all be available on our website for you.